cross-institutional research project examining current practices, policies, and processes of doctoral student writing and publishing at Canadian research-intensive universities. We may not have told you this, but we are about to start our master's program at the Official Languages and Bilingualism Institute. So I think there's also a great interest in learning from your experiences with this, because we will be mentoring students in a close way very soon. We'll have the pleasure to find out about her research here today, but her publications also include research communication in the social and human sciences, from decimation to public engagement, designing global learning environments, visionary partnership policies, and pedagogies. And finally, most recently, a book called Writing in Knowledge Societies. So once again, I want to thank you very much for accepting this invitation. The usual format is for the presentation to occur. You're in full control in terms of how much interaction you want during the presentation. But afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session, which allows people to ask questions and interact with you. But I'd like everyone to welcome Doreen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Jeremy. And thank you for attending on a Friday afternoon with bright sunshine after a hellish winter. So that's something. I guess you're the real devoted ones. I guess, do we have anyone at a distance that we should say hello to? Or? Oh, we don't know, eh? It's okay. It's okay. I mean, if there's anyone out there, I'm sorry I can't see you. I hope you can ask questions. So. But anyway, welcome and thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to also learn a bit more about what you're doing. And with graduate writing, I hear there's a lot of initiatives going on. And I would say we'll keep it fairly informal. So if there's anything that sort of doesn't quite sound like it makes sense to say, Doreen, what was that about again? And, actually, what I've experienced is kind of this, and so I'm much better with conversation than the talking head thing. Do I need to look anywhere? No. I can look wherever I want, right? Okay, perfect. So the talk, what I'm working on right now is I'm very interested in doctoral student writing. Part of the reason is that I have been teaching a course at McGill that is sort of an introduction to research and theory on research writing for graduate students from across the disciplines. And it's a research theory and practice. So it's a research-based sort of writing course that was designed very presciently quite a while ago by my colleague Anthony Perry there. And so in teaching the course, I had, both master's and doctoral students. And I wondered about the doctoral students in particular. I kind of wondered, what I'm saying in this class or what we're doing, does this make any sense when they leave the class? Sort of what happens to them when they leave my class? And why do they even come? Sort of what is it like outside the course for them? So I wanted to understand that a little bit better. And so when I started thinking about the study and working on it, I wasn't really thinking about degree completion at all. I was really just interested in understanding the experience, the lived institutional experience of doctoral students. And so this basically emerged out of the data in the focus on degree completion, because I realized that there are so many ways in which writing plays a role in degree completion, and it's a major issue. So I'll give a bit of an overview. Since there is so much debate right now in Canada, and I think around the world, around doctoral education and degree completion, I thought I'd give a bit of a broader sort of context and a bit of a rationale for this particular part of the project that I'm working on here. And then talk a little bit about the data that this is based on, what I'm going to be talking about, and a bit on the theoretical understanding of how we look at things, or how I have looked at things. And then roles of writing and degree completion are basically findings that address that question for today. Sort of what are the roles of research writing in doctoral degree completion? So, whoops, I think I was a bit too eager here. So one of the problems, or the problem that I'm trying to address, or that I'm trying to look at the data for, is a hot debate in the media. I don't know if you've read University Affairs. They've had a number of features on doctoral degree completion. And so we have actually quite a history of high attrition rates and long times to degree completion. So in the United States and in Canada, we don't have sort of exact data, but it's usually sort of something around roughly 50% across the disciplines, if you take all the disciplines and you take the average. But there's quite a variation, yes. So basically, if 1 in 2 doctoral students are not going to complete their degree. That's currently the situation. And there's quite a bit of variation, and this is actually an article from University Affairs. Somebody was able to get some data from at least the U15, because we don't have national data, about degree completion, and they had data from the 2001 cohort. Within 9 years, 70.6% of the doctoral students completed their degrees. And to just illustrate a bit of the variation, 78% of those were in the 78% completed their degrees in the health sciences, and 55 in the humanities. So it's been called sort of the hottest issue, or the most important issue. Sometimes it's been called a scandalous issue in higher education, around doctoral education. The degree completion rates, there's very little debate about MA students, and very little, well, there is some debate at the undergraduate, but nothing compares to the attrition rates and the long times to degree completion that we currently have in doctoral education. And it is, of course, a very costly problem. We have, you know, the cost to the doctoral students, of course, which, you know, personally, you know, are immeasurable. You know, if you think about somebody spending 9 years on a degree, and then having nothing at the end of that time, and having missed all the income, all the contributions to pensions, and ending up with high debt loads. So it is a severely costly problem, of course, for the students, let alone impact on health, family, and so on. And there's, of course, the institutions. We'll look a little bit more into that, or at that. There's, of course, limited, you know, supervisory capacity at any institution, limited funding for doctoral students. And then, of course, to society, we have large expenditures on research and fellowship. Funding, if you take, for example, the students in genetics, one of the graduate program directors sort of gave me sort of the figure that, say, if you wanted to fund a student just with lab equipment for a year, that is $25,000, and then you have a $25,000 stipend, and that alone is already $50,000 for one student for 1 year. That is, of course, different in other disciplines. And then, of course, we don't have those researchers graduating and contributing to society. And there are, of course, also financial implications to society. So it is a very costly problem. And it's also a multifaceted problem. And this is important. I wanted to point that out when I talk about writing. So one of the things, of course, that I'm going to say is that writing is very important in degree completion. But I also wanted to make sure that you don't think I'm so naive to think that it's everything. So there is quite a bit more going on. We have one of the aspects is we have a huge increase in doctoral enrollments worldwide, so we have a lot more doctoral students coming in. At the same time, we're dealing with a stagnation in hiring of faculty with supervisory capacity. So we have observed a shift toward more casual lecturer positions in terms of hiring than full professors, for example. And at the same time, we're also looking at increased demands on supervisors, both as teachers and as researchers. And we're looking at increased demands on doctoral students. Students now, if they want to pursue a career in academia, are expected to publish much more and to actually show a record of research funding already, that they're able to obtain funding. So there's more demand on everyone, more students, and fewer faculty resources that all sort of, highlight a bit of the complexity of the issue and sort of where writing might fit in. So to look at the first one, the increase in enrollment. This has been quite stunning over the last few years. And there are a few driving forces that are usually reported in the literature. One of them is sort of the interest of governments in R&D, research and development, and innovation potential that comes from research and that, of course, requires qualified researchers. There's a lot of talk about global competitiveness and so-called knowledge-intensive societies. And there's also, McCulloch and Thomas, for example, talk about the economic and labor market instability that brings more people into graduate programs and doctoral programs, and an effort to widen participation to groups that have previously been underrepresented in doctoral programs. So if we look at, you're probably better advised to look at one of those little side things there because it crosses out my table here. So if you look at the increase in doctoral graduates worldwide between 1991 and 2004, you can see that China has increased its number of doctoral graduates by 815% from 2000 to 22,000. Taiwan by 379%. In the US, they already had a fairly high number of doctorates. And in the UK, we also have a fairly high increase. And in Canada, the numbers are from a different, they're actually from Stats Canada. And we had an enrollment that almost doubled between 92 and 2011. At the same time, we also had, we also doubled the number of graduates. But still, Canada, according to the Canada Industry Board, Canada has 35% fewer doctoral graduates than the OECD average. Usually Canada by the, I think it's called the Industry Board of Canada. Correct me if I'm wrong. Could be something else, but I'll look up the, so they basically grade Canadian higher education A and B on all other levels, but for doctoral education, they assign Canada a D in terms of its performance compared to other countries. This is a Canadian sort of industry economics group. And so the other sort of factor that really impacts degree completion is, of course, the increasing demand on doctoral supervisors. As teachers, we carry heavier loads in that we have a higher number of students, larger classes. So between 1992 and 2011, that's where their series runs, we had a 40% of increase in students, in overall students, and but only a 20% increase in teaching staff. And interestingly, there was no increase over all this time in the number of full professors who are most experienced, of course, in supervising doctoral students. The highest increase, more than 100%, has been in non-tenure track staff. who of course, are not supervisory staff. So at the same time, as researchers, we all know we have more pressure on securing grant funding because of the decreasing funding for higher education in general. We have, more pressure on grant funding, of course, means more pressure on publications because, you need to have the longest list of publications to get the grants. And we also have pressure to graduate more doctoral students, and there's pressure on graduating them faster. So, and finally, the increasing demands on doctoral students that has been observed in different countries as well. Aitchison and Kamler and Lee, for example, talk about the more extensive publication records that are being required in Australia. And this is actually a chart from the survey that is part of the study that I'll be drawing on later. And in this question, we asked supervisors to draw on their experience. So this is a perception question. Please indicate, how the demands on doctoral writing for early conference presentation publication, research funding record has changed. And then we offered no change, decrease in demands, but we see sort of a slight increase, great increase in demands, sort of more than half experienced sort of that trend. The research on doctoral degree completion, of course, has been very broad and very rich, and it has identified a number of factors. It's been going on probably since about the 60s, I would say. And some of the factors, they make a lot of sense. Of course, financial support is important for doctoral students, although I do have a number of students in the study who did have financial support for 4 years or 5 years, and it did not affect their experience around writing. It affected their experience in the sense that they may have had more time, but if they still don't know how and what to do, then that time that is being bought for them doesn't really contribute in the same way that it might otherwise. Disciplinary culture, oftentimes the humanities have longer times to completion. Supervisory relationship, very important. Family and health situations, the student background, and department, institutional culture, support, program structure, and all of that. All of this is widely discussed, but none of the studies really address writing, which is somewhat surprising, but then again, as I explain later, somewhat also not, because it is, after all, the main activity through which doctoral students complete their degrees, right? They have to write a dissertation in whichever form. And but that's a fairly common theme, and Kamler and Thompson and Lee and Aitchison have observed researchers in Australia who have done a lot of work on doctoral writing, that it is one of the major sites of anxiety among doctoral students and supervisors, but it's really, nobody really addresses it. And usually it's something that is very invisible, remains unaddressed, and is sort of taken for granted. And this is interesting. This was particularly interesting to me. This is a study by Gardner about attribution, about what comes up, of course, when you have a costly problem like this is who's to blame, right? So, and the first group, of course, that ends up being blamed very heavily is students. And sort of they're being assessed as having a lack of ability, lack of drive, lack of focus, motivation, initiative, they're unprepared. And in fact, in, I think it was in Lovett's study, 2/3 of the faculty who were asked, sort of, what do you think is the reason for these attrition problems? identified the students as the problem. And sometimes that also includes student self-blame, actually, that the students blame themselves, that they think, oh, you know, maybe it just wasn't the right fit, maybe I just don't fit here, or that sort of thing. And we also, of course, blame deficient supervisors, you know, who just don't mentor their graduate students efficiently, and they're too slow. And all of these assumptions, of course, have implications for what kinds of interventions are being undertaken, right? The first one usually is directed then at fixing the students, you know, another workshop and another workshop, and giving them the tight leash, right? The deadline, you know, the dead deadline. And then sometimes, of course, you know, the buck gets passed around to the administrators, and the lack of funding, lack of support, poor regulation, poor progress tracking, poor admissions procedures, you know, we're just not choosing the right students, sort of thing, right? Program structures and requirements. The Modern Language Association, for example, thinks now that the doctoral thesis should somehow be done away with, that sort of thing. So there, all of these, of course, lead to certain kinds of interventions. And I think what I've learned from the doctoral students and from my research, in answer to the question of who's to blame, none of the above. And I'll get into that a little bit later. For now, I'll just talk a little bit about the study. So the study was a longitudinal study, multi-institutional. We worked with students and supervisors and program directors at the 11 most research intensive Anglophone universities. The study was called The State of Writing, or it is called, in Canadian Doctoral Education. Some of the questions that guided us, as I said, it came out of really trying to understand. There hasn't really been a study like that anywhere, you know, across institutions. Sort of, what is it really like for the students? What are the practices currently? What are the demands? What challenges do the current practices present to supervisors, to doctoral students, to administrators? And how do they deal with them? And we're also interested in how people thought of writing and what support there was. Our methodology, the main thing I think about this is that we're taking a systemic approach that is grounded in rhetorical theories of genre and discourse, which I'll explain a little bit more, but it completely sort of shifts the whole blame problem. So we look at writing and discourse as a social practice. So writing is not something that somebody owns. It's shaped by collectives. The way something is written is shaped by, let's say, the discipline of management or physics or anthropology. They all, over time, sort of shape their own ways of writing. And so the writing that is done is very situated there in terms of the kind of knowledge that an anthropologist needs to make, for example, in being very reflective of how they interact with participants. So, for example, the use of I is very important. In that field, you go to a physics person and they'll say, oh, no, you know, no I, you know, it's a passive voice here. It's passive voice land, right? And so these the ways of writing in the discourse and the discourses that exist, they've sort of emerged historically over time, right? There's not really a first time. They're sort of inherited, like when the doctoral student gets there to the discipline, they're not the first one to be writing a dissertation, right? So there have been patterns that have evolved over time, and they precede the individual. And at the same time, they emerge historically through repetition, and they become regularized to be a certain way, so that a certain range of writing is appropriate in anthropology for a dissertation, and another range of writing is appropriate in physics. And the key about this is that these ways of writing and these discourses, because they get repeated so often, they become very normalized, right? So, well, it's just the way we do things, you know. Didn't we know we phrase a research question like that? Well, of course we do, you know. How else would you do it, right? So it becomes very normalized, and so even the discourses around writing, which is what I'm interested in, how people talk about writing, and what that means for students and faculty. So they're kind of normalized. We inherit them from previous generations, the way we talk and think about writing. And so they usually escape reflection. You know, it's just the way we talk. And they're also non-neutral. That is, they have consequences. And those are different for different participants. They reproduce values and so on. I think Charles Bazerman and Paul Pryor, two researchers in writing studies, put it very nicely in that a systemic view of writing, they say, does not ask how novices acquire or fail to acquire the genres owned by some particular community, let's say anthropology or physics. Instead, this view of writing considers how generic, that is regularized, repeated activity, is implicated in the ongoing reproduction of participants and their activities, of course. And that systemic view allows us to look, to avoid the whole blame game altogether, and to look back and try to collaboratively reflect on the discourses that currently inform our thinking about writing and that we have inherited. It's really nobody's fault. We just inherit these things and we get placed into a situation, and there they unfold, and we unfold with them. Of course, you know, we do change them, sometimes depending on needs. They're not static, but they do have consequences, and it is important to work collaboratively and to reflect on them. So the study had multiple layers. One of them was an analysis of institutional discourses about writing. Sort of how do people talk about writing in institutions, right? What do they think writing is? What do they think it means for students to write? And so we looked at graduate school meta-genres, guidelines like tip sheets, handbooks, that sort of stuff. And we also did exploratory surveys of doctoral students and supervisors and administrators. And we had interviews with students, supervisors, and administrators. And so the data sources that I'm going to draw on here for today, they are from extended open-ended interviews with 60 doctoral students. They were from across the disciplines in different stages of their programs and at multiple institutions. And the questions that I sort of had in mind that guided my interviews were, what is it like for them? What are their lived experiences with writing in their daily interactions? What discourses about writing do they encounter? What do people tell them what writing is? Or what do they get? What do they understand? And what consequences do those discourses have for them? What happens to them? And one of the key insights, this is sort of more that guides the study theoretically, is a rhetorical perspective. That's not surprising. I happen to be a rhetorician, I guess. So we look at, let's say, the dissertation, for example, as a genre. That is, as a regularized, habitual, sort of repeated social practice that specific research cultures develop to meet a certain need. For example, to train researchers that become disciplined in particular ways of thinking to be able to do particular kinds of research, let's say the research in anthropology or in chemistry or whatever. And those genres actually do the work of those research cultures. You know, that the grant proposal gets the money, right, and helps researchers articulate their studies and so on. So the important thing is that they're central to the activities of the research cultures. They cannot be removed from those activities. So from a rhetorical perspective, again, we see writing as situated, as specific to the research cultures. And as culturally shared practices. So it's not the student who thinks up how they're going to write. They're going to have to write within the kinds of practices that everyone understands, that people have come to expect over time. And that means that when doctoral students come to the scene, they encounter new genres that they haven't encountered in their MA and that they haven't encountered in their BA, and they may even come from different disciplines. And so a new genre for a doctoral student is a completely new territory. And so it becomes a curricular problem, is how do I mentor and introduce a student to that genre. And another key insight from rhetorical studies is that writing is epistemic. This all draws from the same researchers. That is, it is constitutive of knowledge. It is not something we use to wrap knowledge up in, like to write up. It's a very interesting phrase in research writing and in the discourse about research writing. It is actually deep intellectual work to work out what your findings will be, what it might mean in the community, given the conversations that are currently going on. For example, even things like the passive voice has very specific epistemic functions, let's say in biology or in physics than it might have in history, where it's used for making knowledge about different kinds of things. The way, for example, a research question is phrased, whether it's a hypothesis, whether it's a problématique, or has implications for what we're asking, for what we know, the kinds of evidence that is considered acceptable. Is a personal narrative considered acceptable in terms of persuasive evidence, or is it not considered acceptable? So you can't really take that out. Can you ask provocative questions without answering them in your dissertation? But that all depends on the expectations that that particular research community has developed. And of course, they're endless because it's a culture. And a genre basically is a cultural space, a dissertation where particular things happen, where particular kinds of researchers are being shaped. And they evolve, again, historically through repetition, means that they exist before the participants come. And what is important is, no matter how much we tell someone, this is how you write a thesis, we know that writing is not learned that way. Because it is a social practice, it is learned through gradually increasing participation. And ideally mentored participation. And ideally also, while allowing a space for some critical exploration, to think about how have ways of writing sort of shaped what we can and cannot know. How do those genres limit what can and cannot be said, where it has to be said, and how it has to be said. And again, what's important here, and this is really the crux, is that, again, through the constant repetition, through their historical status of evolution, they become invisible, which means that this is a work that my colleague Anthony Perry has done, which means that it is extremely difficult, quite impossible, for supervisors to actually recognize the genres. It's just normal for them. It's just clear writing, of course, because they've done it forever. And so to them, it's all clear. It's all normal, right? But it's a culture. So we don't really see the culture. And so it's very difficult. Anthony has documented the struggles that supervisors have to try to articulate to students what it is, how the genre actually functions, if they do articulate it. Very often, and this is what I'm hearing from the students, is that the students are just being expected to know these genres that have evolved in the community to do these things that they've never encountered before, that is really for them new land. But they are, of course, saturated with norms, values, assumptions, and demands and identity. Just to give you an example, I like to use an example. It's a colleague in London, Joan Turner, who reports about her work with a student from Korea, a graduate student who was learning to write for publication in her university in London. And apparently what she had learned in Korea was for the conclusion to say, well, okay, so if we look at the data this way, you know, we might conclude this. If we look at the data this way, we might conclude B. You know, if we look at the data this way, we might conclude C. If we look at the data this way, and so on, right? And of course, for her, that was a very polite way. And you can tell it's an epistemically very rich genre that does not cut off and make one authoritative statement the way we tend to expect it in her field, perhaps in a Western institution. So there is a demand on her all of a sudden to come out and, in her view, be rude and make this authoritative statement that she doesn't want to do. And of course, you know, the supervisor says, oh, you can't write. Go to the writing center and get fixed. Right? So I mean, I don't think this was in this case, but this is what I see happen quite a bit with the students that I've talked to, is, you know, and that, you know, the supervisor is not to be blamed. Again, for them, it's very normalized, you know, that, you know, of course you don't write this way, right? You write this way, right? That's clear and that's not clear, right? So what that means, that also helps us understand why the strong problem with degree completion in doctoral education. Why not in master's education, and why not in undergraduate education, at least not to the same extent? And this is a comment that I see quite often in my study. This is a student, she said, I never really had any problems writing. I had actually 2 MA theses. I never had any problems. Then finally coming here, doing my PhD, I felt like I had all these problems. I didn't know how to write anymore. I was like, well, it was just the wrong choice maybe. So it was suddenly like I was just bad, not a good student anymore. Whereas before I had never had any problems. So you can already see the kinds of implications of, well, maybe it's the wrong choice, the lack of fit that is, you know, often identified by students sort of when they leave. And the stress, you know, because when we have doctoral students, you know, we have the, what are they, the overachievers, right? That are always good students. They're used to being good students, right? So, but for doctoral writing, what is very different is, of course, that a doctoral student, for them, writing in academia is workplace writing. Right? A PhD is always about the participation in a scholarly conversation. It's not just about research itself. Lots of people do research without having to have a PhD. It's about that participation in that scholarly research conversation. It's about becoming a part of that larger workplace that's academia. And a master's student very often leaves and goes on and has a career, that sort of stuff. Or they go on and then move into the PhD in that way. So what do we find, though, in terms of the discourses that we saw circulating? And this is from a paper that we've done on institutional discourses about writing with Ivy Sun and Nazi El-Besra, who are doctoral students working with us. And what we found was sort of that assumption as writing as this universal skill, right? Not something that is socially situated in a particular research community, a particular research culture, but it's this universal skill. You just have it, right? It's something that's just it's just expected. It's totally unproblematic. And so, well, you know, if you don't, in our lingo we would say, well, if you don't understand the genre, you know, then you must have a skills deficit from that skills perspective. And now remember, again, these are inherited discourses, right? They have been around for a long time. And then, of course, we have remediation, skills therapy for you. And the student, of course, is the problem, right? And this is something that, you know, of course, we've seen this all in undergraduate research on writing. Mike Rose in 1985 was talking about that sort of understanding of writing as something that happens outside of the research cultures. It's, and you know, then these students come in with these underdeveloped writing skills, you know, and we just got to go and fix them. And if you give them this one more workshop, and then they'll be fixed, right? That's what Mike Rose calls the myth of transience. That we can just sort of fix students and fix them again and fix them some more. Of course, we know that writing doesn't work that way. And then because of that, because we see writing as a universal skill, we also saw that it was seen as separate from the knowledge work of the discipline. it was quite interesting. Most of the graduate school websites that we looked at thought as of, interestingly, the dissertation was the knowledge product of the discipline, right? What would be produced in the discipline. But the processes of writing the dissertation, that was next to mental health clinics, chaplaincy, and all kinds of other services. It was quite fascinating, and it comes because of that discourse, right? That thinks of writing as a sort of unproblematic universal skill, rather than as that set of sort of regularized research practices that newcomers need to be sort of socialized and mentored into. And so the idea is, well, you went to high school, right? So what's your problem? You know, so you learned how to write, right? And then the idea is, oh, at the doctoral level, well, they just write a little more, right? Rather than as a qualitatively completely different experience in terms of what the student needs to do, who they need to become, and that whole transformative aspect of turning somebody into a scholar that thinks in a particular way. And so what we have then is, of course, the students as deficient from that skills discourse. It usually goes along with the deficit model of students and their need of remediation and fixing. So what we see as a result, of course, then is a lot of ad hoc services, another workshop, you know, to fix whatever. The problem is when the students come back, and so the supervisor says, okay, go to another workshop, you know, or some boot camp or whatever. And the student comes back, but of course, usually those workshops are not staffed with people with the research background in writing. And so they give them, don't use the passive voice, and don't use too many quotations, and don't whatever, you know, kind of, and don't use jargon, right, is what I hear. And use drunk and white, you know, which will tell you something like, I don't know, don't use unnecessary words or something like that, right? But what's an unnecessary word in a dissertation for this particular research culture, you know, that of course is something that only somebody can know who is in the discipline. It's only the supervisor who can know that sort of thing. And so as I said, so we get a lot of non-research-based rhetorical advice, sort of the universal skills type stuff, you know, alongside other services like mental health, that sort of stuff. And the consequences of this kind of discourse for the students are profound, from what I understood, as you can imagine. There's a number of ways that the students are affected by this discourse. One of them is directly, in terms of how they then, you know, because these discourses circulate, is how they then think about writing, and what happens to them around their writing. One of them, of course, is then how supervisors think about writing. Competing assumptions that they have around writing. And another way is, of course, through the institutional interventions. And now remember, all of these work based on inherited discourses that just never get questioned or reflected on because, you know, let's face it, we're all busy, right? So we're all just running with what we have inherited and what we have to work with. So I've listed about 10 ways in which current discourses about writing at institutions extend times to degree for doctoral students. And I'll give you examples for each of them if you're interested. One of them is they spend a fair amount of time working through confusion about what it is they're expected to write, what those genres now are. They try to make sense of ill-defined institutional genres where they go on, they're being sent on wild goose chases, basically for remediation. Presumably somebody out there on campus can teach them how to write a dissertation in mathematics or anthropology. So then they work on those perfect drafts because, you know, writing is just, you just have those thoughts somewhere, right, in your research, and then you just wrap it up and you just write it up, right? So yeah, of course you can just do a perfect draft and give me as a supervisor just that perfect draft, right? Without understanding the genre. So they have no idea when something is good enough to submit. And they fret horribly over, is this good enough? Or is it not good enough? Is that what I'm supposed to be doing? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing? They spend a fair amount of time in fear of submitting drafts because of that underlying assumption, that culture, that discourse that says writing is just a universal skill. You learned it in high school, and if you can't do it, then there's something wrong with you. So they're afraid to look dumb if they can't do it, and so they're afraid to ask questions. They spend a lot of time, I said time spent, on navigating the unacknowledged divergent genre expectations among faculty on the committees, because oftentimes the committee members come from different disciplines who all have their own cultural ways of writing that have become normalized. But of course, everyone thinks that's the good way to write. That's the clear way to write, right? Because it's become so normalized. And Anthony's work has also shown that supervisors really never really had any introduction to writing themselves. So most of them just get there. And they've all said, you know, the best I could do is try to follow my supervisor to the bathroom. I could talk to her for 5 minutes or something. And so they're kind of used to this. And now they're expected to supervise under fairly complex conditions. They're also dealing with unacknowledged competing genres within the program. Most programs have, I'm not sure what that's like for you guys, but let's say in education, you know, you have philosophers, you know, you have literacy folks, you know, you have linguists, you have historians, you have science education folk, and all of those people, of course, have their own genres, their own research cultures that have developed particular ways of writing. Where for a philosopher, like a methods chapter, like what would you do that? What would you do that for, right? What's that? And then the students, of course, go to the research methods course, and they have to fake a methodology section. Of course, they're not going to have a methodology, but you know, of course, everyone thinks that's a normal way to write, right? And so we have one of the things that institutions then do is they try to set up seminars around the genres that the students don't understand. But then they send one faculty member there who comes from the perspective of one research culture with one set of genre expectations and asks the students to write the comprehensive exams according to what they think is clear writing. And the students go back to their supervisors, and the supervisor says, well, what's that? You know, we don't write like that. And so the student rewrites again. So you see how that sort of underlying discourse, those underlying assumptions inform a lot of what students experience. So the same is true for proposal seminar, doctoral colloquia. And in some cases, it leads to mental health issues for the students around the anxieties that they experience and the gradually diminished confidence. And I'll have some quotes for that. And then it also, the competing assumptions about writing, what the supervisor thinks how writing works, or how it should work based on the discourses that currently inform our institutional practices around writing, and what the student actually can do, given that they're a newcomer to a new land. So you also end up with a lot of conflict between supervisor and student around issues that they're not aware of. That they're just underlying different assumptions around writing, and that makes future interactions between the student and the supervisor much more difficult and time-consuming. Any thoughts for now, or before I go into the examples? So I said, you know, they spend a fair amount of time working through the confusion. So what is this? And here are some of the ways this sounds like in the voices of the students. So one student said, it's almost like me visiting a foreign land and not knowing the language, not knowing what are these rules here, what are the norms. I kind of have to figure it out on my own. This is a very common theme. It's as if I'm sitting on the outside and I can see that there's conversation going on among these people that I like, and I'm excited by, and I kind of get what they're saying, but I have to figure out the norms. And I have to figure them out on my own. There's nobody really showing me sort of what the lay of the land is. There's nobody giving me an orientation. And of course, you know, if you think about writing as a universal skill, what orientation to what, right? You learned it in high school. Another student said, I liked her analogy. I just kind of felt a little bit like there's this kind of road that everybody's on, and I'm kind of on the side trying to hitchhike, trying to get somebody to slow down and show me where we're supposed to go, because I just don't ever really feel that I'm on the right path. And that uncertainty is very, it's very draining on the students. They don't know if this is the appropriate genre, if this is the right way, what the genre is supposed to do. What are they supposed to do in that comps paper? Say, well, write about the literature, right? Well, you know, we'll get to some examples along those lines here. So this has been one of the most enlightening sort of areas for me. This is around the comprehensive exams. And in these cases, these are social science students. The comprehensive exams are usually some sort of really ill-defined paper that they have to write, usually a group of papers, 2 or 3. They can vary really across disciplines. Sometimes comprehensive exams is like a, you know, it's like a Trivial Pursuit. You know, you have to remember all the musicians from 1 century and all the notes and all of that stuff, right? But in this case, it's go write a paper, right? And so this is how one student, but what the paper needs to do as a genre, what it needs to do for the student, what it needs to do for their preparation, for doing their own research, how they need to be, and how that paper works to transform them into a gradually more and more participatory member. You know, there's no talk about that. So this is what one student says. But for the comps paper, I'm taking so much time because I'm lost. That's a huge problem in doctoral education. The comps don't get done. And it's not surprising if we think about it from a writing perspective. And I don't know what they want. Some say we're going to assess your knowledge on the field. So I'm like, okay, so I talked about, I always take out the identifying things about the subject because that's part of my field. And then I talked a lot, like 3 or 4 pages, and they say it's too much. So I had to cut it out. So I don't know what they want. I seriously don't know. I still don't know. I'm writing the paper and I don't know. So how much to write, where to write. In this case, in some cases, we have a really lethal combination of an institutionally demanded setup genre, at the same time sort of ill-defined, and at the same time not allowing the students to have any dialogue about it. If there is a sure recipe for disaster, that would be it. And then add telling the students it's comprehensive, and you know, we're going to test you on the knowledge of the field. They'll never get that because there's nothing that, you know, tell the doctoral student, you know, we're testing you on the knowledge in your field. Do I know enough? No, I don't. Of course I don't. But none of us do, of course. So, and then this is what another student, the students then try to come up with ways to deal with this sort of ill-defined, weird thing that they can't talk about to the supervisors who sort of, you know, and the department. So, so this student says a lot of students go in extremely intimidated by it, the comprehensive exams, right? And so it was for myself, and there was a group of 5 of us who planned on starting our comprehensive exam. And so we were looking for a name for our group, and I said, well, why don't we call it the 3 Small Paper Group? Because it really is 3 papers, right? And so just these kind of mental things that came up during the meeting that we had with the students, just reconfiguring it. So they spend a lot of time actually trying to make sense of things that are ill-defined for them so that they can deal with them. And of course, if it's not defined, one of the things that came up when I talked to the students about the comprehensive exams, I said, well, what does that term call up for you? Well, comprehensive, I have to write just about everything, right? And exams, you know, I mean, that conjures up like schools, you know, sitting there sweating in fear and being tested and, you know, being kicked out if you don't pass it or whatever. And of course, you know, sort of that's where the school discourse, the assessment discourse comes in. But what we want from the students is something very different. Right? We want them to become participants in a research culture. And of course, we know that writing is learned through mentored participation in the discourses. And so sending them out into the desert and saying, hey, you must not talk to anyone, we're not really telling you what it really is we're asking you. Sorry, am I done? Okay. Yeah. And then the interesting thing is, so then they realize, okay, no, they don't get done, the students. So then we're devising a helping genre as a department or whatever. And so there were some departments that came up with a concept proposal. And then the student says, well, if I don't know how to write the comps, I'm not really sure how to write a comps proposal, right? And also, I felt like I can't write a proposal to do something when I have no idea. It's like saying, okay, I'm going to write a proposal for my trip to Asia. I'm going to talk about what city I'll start in and then what road I'm going to take, except I don't actually have the map of Asia and I don't actually know what cities there are, but I'm going to propose how I'm going to travel there. So there are a lot more examples, but since we're out of time, maybe I'll just use a couple of them for attrition. This is how the assumption that students should just know how to write in a doctoral program, should just know their genres. This is the student's experience. And he felt that the professors in his program are particularly cruel in saying, oh, this is terrible, this is like a piece of shit or whatever. The teacher just threw my essay in my face and said, we're here to say intelligent things. And I was shocked. I was really considering to drop the program because I thought I was not able to do it or I didn't have the capacity. So the students then start blaming themselves. And in this case, the program did indeed lose half the fellow students of that intake. And there's not much help or advice on how to proceed doing it. You just learn basically by rejections, by accumulating bad experiences. And well, it's a tough way to learn, and I wish there could be another way, because many of the people get discouraged. Half of them just quit the program because they couldn't cope with the system, the pressure. Maybe they're really, really tight deadlines, plus they didn't know what to do or how to do it, how to write or what is expected from them. Well, this is another student who was expected to pull together a short grant and was then told that she was incompetent because she didn't do it and almost wasn't going to pursue her doctoral degree. And she really felt there was something wrong with her, that she couldn't pull together a budget for a multi-site short program. So for concluding thoughts, writing definitely is the main activity of doctoral scholars, and we need to see it as that. It has been a silent but significant factor in doctoral degree completion. There are large amounts of money currently spent on non-research-based activities to fix presumably deficient students. And those activities, from what we understand so far, don't do very much for the students other than extending their times to degree completion. So the problem is not really deficient students or deficient supervisors or deficient administrators. And it's not the dissertation that's wrong, because even if you started changing the dissertation, you'd still have an ill-defined institutional genre that somebody would have to figure out, right? It's more a problem of really taking the time of looking at the discourses that shape how we think and act about writing, and for us to take time to have some collaborative reflection on those discourses and what they do, and what they can do for some curricular innovation in terms of putting writing where it belongs in the disciplines. So. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'll just make one comment. This was a walk down a very bad meeting.
I'm sorry. And that on a Friday afternoon.
Because I know it was me. I came to do my PhD like my came back to school so I had a career, been a manager, written up, work in language training and proposals and combination of different things between the research advisors that I had. And in some cases, I would say, and I have to be very careful because somebody in this room probably knows some of them, so I have to be very careful. But it was, I had one who would, the comments would always be in capital letters, and to the point, and I was writing my thesis in English. English was my first language. And I get comments like, are you really a native speaker of this language? Like, it was just brutal, absolutely brutal. And to the point where I graduated 7 years ago, I have published maybe 3 articles. I am paralyzed.
Yes.
Absolutely
yes.
paralyzed.
Yeah.
And the only way I got through my thesis was I got an integral physics, was I got my husband, who was a PhD in physics, to read it through for me. And we got the passives and then the non-passives. But I worked through, I would not show it to her until I ratified it about 5 times.
Yeah, yeah.
It was absolutely,
Well, it's, sorry, I called this up, but I think it's really something that we desperately need to talk about because it's been surprising to me as well. And I think, I think what the power is of this approach is that it's not necessarily the supervisor. The supervisor works on assumptions. And more than likely, if she has not had any sort of exposure to writing, if she has not had any faculty development of some sort in this area, she had to go through this herself. So she just does what she learned from her supervisor. And what I find is that, so they get frustrated. They can't articulate really what's wrong. And so they start picking at the little things that they can see that are wrong. They're frustrated. And so that's what you get, but they can't get at the bottom of this.
I think in her case, I can leave it to an defense, but that's all. It means I'm not coming in as a 20-something student either.
Yeah.
And so, well, I don't know, right? Like, look at how old you are. Look at you.
Yes.
But it is a completely different.
It's a different, yeah.
From what I was doing before.
Very different research culture, very different writing culture, workplace culture for sure. Absolutely, yeah. So no, it was not your fault. It was, yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there are a lot of students that are suffering, and one student actually, the one who experienced that situation where she was asked to pull a grant together, she actually ended up with an autoimmune disease. So I mean, we don't know, if it's related, but there are lots of, I had one student, this was not in the study, who had been told by her supervisor that she can't write and that she should go back home. She wasn't able to eat food for 2 weeks. So it was devastating for her. And then, of course, the students get sent to a writing center that usually doesn't have the institutional support to really be staffed with people who, understand this from a research perspective. And so they give her strong and white. She goes back to the supervisor. Of course, she still does not write in the way the research culture works. And oh my God, the writing center couldn't fix me. I must be really beyond fixing now. So that's where the discourses are so, it's sort of amazing how discourses shape our actions. But I mean, we're all in them, right? But until we sort of take the time to sort of step back and reflect a little bit on what do we inherit here? Where does this stuff come from? What does it really do? So. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
And the paradox of scholars wanting to be a historian or a psychologist or a linguist, but not wanting to be a writer, right? We don't identify ourselves as writers, even though that's what we are as scholars. And I think it's interesting to flip it on the other side. The people who enjoy learning to write are often the people in departments like composition studies or creative writing, where they do identify themselves explicitly. Our identity is as a writer, and our work is to mentor newcomers as new writers. And those are the people who end up saying, I love writing, and because they are looking at it much more in the way that you're thinking about it, whether it's distancing and saying, I'm a historian, when writing is somebody else's job, or it's the language teacher's job, it's not my job. Yeah. Just absolutely right. Just puts people in a box, and it's a very bad spot to be in. But the strength of that discourse is amazing because as soon as you,
it's very powerful.
I think it's also tied to, like, some people have taken a hold on who gets to teach the writing, and therefore
Yeah.
I'm really nervous if you say, well, you know, it's writing is in a discipline, so maybe the disciplinary people should teach writing too. And
Yeah, go over so well last week.
yeah, no.
But it also depends on the support that institutions give to teachers. I think a teacher should have, you know, a professor, you know, should have a course release for a semester, be able to meet with colleagues, and somebody who does this sort of work, and become a research writing fellow or a writing fellow in the department and start, you know, developing initiatives, that sort of stuff. And right now, we're just, and that money is there, you know, and look at, I mean, let's say if you had that professor come to a session, you know, let's say they developed a collaborative paper or whatever with their graduate student, or they actually wrote a paper where they reflected on what they did and how they would explain it to a student, where they actually studied their genres, how they work, how to articulate them, that sort of stuff, looked at a bit of research around this, maybe developed, redeveloped their course, you know, from a writing perspective, you know, sort of in ways that they haven't done before. I mean, it's really minuscule compared to the massive amounts of money that are being spent on these workshops and boot camps, and you know, let alone the massive amounts of money that students spend, that, you know, institutions spend on, you know, and, you know, I mean, it's really, you know, but then it's always, yeah, it's writing, you know, we'll talk about when we have some free time, right? No, you know, I mean, if you want change, you know, you really have to, you know, make it something that, you know, professors apply for.
Doreen, I have a question, because I assumed when I was doing my PhD, I had a mandatory course, I think it was the second year, called Writing a Thesis in Education. Mm-hmm. And we're just grad students, 6 of us, mm-hmm. and the person teaching this course was a director of the department, so a full professor, mm-hmm. and the whole curriculum, the 12 weeks were built around this. So we had a week on methodology, and then, you know, they would ask us to write 2 pages or 3 pages. So we will, all 6 of us, bring those pages and compare them and discuss how we should write about when it's qualitative, how should we write about stats, and then we move, you know, we would move to the review of the literature, and then we would move to, so, you know, those, and I assumed somehow, because of course I have very good memory of this, it helped me greatly, you know, to have this group of 6 or 7 students, sure. And it was a credited course, so we had marks for it, and it was like any other course, and of course I think I was listening to what you were saying, and I couldn't imagine not having done this. Like, it would have been a nightmare, you know. So they would invent us studies, giving us the results, and think, okay, now write about those results. So it was lots of writing, but, you know, I mean, in those 12 weeks we were complaining because it was a huge workload in this course, and I didn't work much on my thesis because I was writing so much about fictive methodologies and, you know, fictive results and, you know, fictive stuff, that I was not working on my thesis. But then once we went through this, it was so much, you know, I was like, because I had all those papers with comments from all my colleagues. So I had not only one chapter, 3 pages on methodology, I had 6 times this. And then when I was, you know, when I was writing about my results and what was my project, I was just pulling out, thinking, oh, I think Jennifer was, you know, did say something or formulate something that we all like. So I was just, you know, using this, this database. And my question to you, have you heard? I mean, is it still there? Did it disappear from curricula, or I don't know?
Well, I've seen quite a bit of it. I've seen, like, as I said, you know, some departments then come up, you know, develop comprehensive exam seminars, proposal seminars, you know, thesis seminars. I think there's a couple of things that I've heard students say.
Because I think we should advocate for this kind of things, like the, you know, writing seminar, which is mandatory, which is part of the program.
Well, my dream is that every professor has the opportunity to have professional development, and that every professor turns every course into a course where writing is attended, where the professor understands that writing involves identity issues, that writing involves issues where you need to negotiate whether or not you want to be in that particular group or not, or how you deal with if you have competing committee members that come from different genre expectations, what do you do about that? And that those people who come from different genre expectations actually know not to make competing demands on the students, that somebody realizes, no, 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 my way is not just clear writing, my way is actually that way of my research culture. That sort of thing. So that would be my dream, is that, you know, students have that exposure in every course, and that the writing is not taken out. So whatever the students write in that course, you know, basically attends to writing from a way that understands writing as a situated cultural practice that is not neutral, that does make certain demands on who the students are, and that does allow for students to negotiate, you know, whether they're comfortable with that. And you know, and also, you know, what I find a lot in those kinds of courses is the problem is that we often get a professor who has not, I mean, in your case, it seems like at least you got to exposed to a range of, you know, sort of genres in your field. But oftentimes, you know, what I hear from students is that they get sort of the genre sort of expectations of that one professor that they developed in their research culture. And then they have to produce that writing for them. But then they go to their supervisor, and what happened to you? You still can't write. And but of course, it's their, you know, genre expectations. Now, for some students, they still find it a useful experience once they understand that, okay, it's not that what I did was wrong. I was just, you know, sort of, I guess, being asked to write in somebody else's culture. And now I have to go back and, you know, sort of, I suppose, you know, it creates a certain flexibility. But, you know, what I would...
as you said, through the exposure.
Yes.
So, okay, if you have seen, you know, different types of, you know, writing about methodology, and they are all, and you know, because you know it from your course, okay, they're all acceptable, different, but
in different places. It's situated, right? Depends on where you are. In one place, a reflective component is the cat's pajamas at this point, and another place it'd be suicide. You know, so I mean, it's depending on where you write.
Can I ask kind of a related question to, I guess, what Monica was saying and what you were just commenting on? I was, you know, it kind of struck me that, again, I was reflecting over my PhD experience, which came from the same department as Sheila's, and
Department needs help.
and then I was just wondering if any of your participants mentioned if they had read a full PhD thesis through their studies, because I find that I don't think that I did. I probably had a few PhD theses that were recommended to me for certain things, or I would look up and extract information that was useful for me. But you know, by the time I actually looked at a full table of contents of a PhD thesis, I was already writing my PhD thesis. And so I think that because it's so much genre specific and field specific, it's always, I think it's good to be able to you know, find a good model that you can follow that's closely related to your field. And it's just so easy for a supervisor to perhaps recommend that. I mean, you know, I didn't come up with that idea myself, and I wrote my thesis without really reading a full PhD thesis. But in retrospect, I guess I should have, right?
Well, it depends, I guess, you know, because there are a number of things that happen around that. I think that does get recommended to students sometimes, but there's a couple of things. One of them is, one student put it very nicely. She said, you know, I can critique this car for you, but I still don't know how to make one. I can critique this suit for you, but I still don't know how to make one. And that is something that we've seen in research on writing, that you learn through doing it. You learn through participation in the genres. And the other thing that's very important is that any piece of writing, any dissertation, you know, or any genre inscribes a certain range of identities of who you can and cannot be, how you can and cannot write. And some of those ways are downright or can be offensive to some students, or it's just not who they are, what kind of work, who they want to become. And so if you give a student a thesis and say, here, do likewise, they may not be that reflective type that can sort of, do an autoethnographic whatever piece, or they may not be that type that can do this sort of, or wants to do this sort of, sort of hardcore, introduction method, discussion, results, discussion, conclusion sort of thing. And so I think one of the things that is important then is to actually sit down with the student and talk about it. But then we run into the problems that we haven't really provided our faculty. We haven't really invested in our faculty to give them the support to be able to talk about writing. And it's, think about it, if somebody asked me all of a sudden to include math in my discussions with my students, I'd have to have somebody to, introduce me into this and to sort of say, there's a lot of research on this, and it has consequences, for what I do, and it has consequences in people's lives, So I think it is really important to really invest in faculty, because they are the ones, who sort of constantly sort of run with their colleagues, who constantly sort of understand where the conversation is at, what you have to say at this particular point, here in this particular sentence, but not there, and that sort of thing, or what goes here, what does not go there, that sort of thing. So I think it's important. I think your point is well taken, sort of to do the genre analysis, but not to leave the student alone with it, I would say. But then, of course, remember that this is all in a larger context where we have an increasing number of doctoral students, we have a decreasing number of faculty to supervise, right? We have an increase in expectations of faculty, an increase in expectations of students. And then at the same time, and I think this is where this whole issue around writing is really sort of bubbling to the surface. And it's, it's where it's really coming up, where it doesn't work anymore what we used to do, where those discourses are starting to become very questionable and problematic.
Do you think it's actually too late to start having these discussions with our doctoral students? We're expecting students to have publications now before being admitted to doctoral programs. We're actually looking for master's students to have publications before they get into a master's program.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Thinking back to this discussions we were at the Faculty of Arts last week, where students don't really know, they pick a discipline, they pick a faculty, and then they get a course taught by a literature specialist about the foundations of writing in university for 3 faculties. But no, there's never a discussion really about genre. And so if we don't have those discussions, and I think that the attrition rates are viewed very differently between the doctoral program and the BA, because there's an expectation that you sort of get the riffraff also in the BA, but you're supposed to get the cream of the crop by the time you get to the doctoral program. So it's even more shocking that you might be losing 50%, or they might need 9 years to completion. But we were looking at some of the data because our program is under evaluation right now. And at the university, for BA, less than 2/3 of students get a BA after 6 years. It is a 4-year BA. Nobody seems to worry about this so much.
Yeah.
But the numbers are there. But these discussions about writing and voice, I'm francophone in a minority context, and we actually take on the blame on ourselves and say it's linguistic insecurity. It's because I don't have enough vocabulary because I'm in a linguistic minority area. So it comes off as linguistic insecurity rather than discussions. It's very refreshing to see it presented as you did today. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for your comment.
Waiting till they get the exit. Should we have those discussions during those formative years? That is the
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. It's just that at the undergraduate, the writing never goes out anywhere. It's just, it's just used as a tool to manage, assess, and control students. Make sure they reproduce what they need to reproduce, and then that's it for the writing.
But they'll be writing for the workplace eventually. So, our work right now, we're very worried because our employers are telling the University of Ottawa that our students don't know how to write.
Work with employers should be sort of thinking about their own genres that we can't really teach at university.
So the links, then our master's programs are upset at the BA people because the master's students don't know how to write.
Blame game.
But so everybody's looking at the high school teacher.
Yes, I know.
I
I know.
I only know all of the genres, but if I'm grade 12, you know, and it's more than spelling. It's more than syntax.
It's how we are. It's being, doing. Yeah.
So thank you so much for your talk.
Well, thank you for your comments.
It was exactly what I needed to hear today. Thank you so
I
much.
think it's right on. Oh, good, because I kind of feel bad, you know, that's lovely sunshine out there, so.
It's very good.
I'm actually very disappointed that the Vice Dean of Graduate Studies from the different faculties were not here.
Franz sent it around. Franz is not here today. Andrew Taylor wanted to be here today, but couldn't be
But
here.
it could be all of the faculties. There are an awful lot of them, and people from FGPS should be here as well. Well, I have. Well, yes, I had to. Told Claire Turen-Schollender that this was happening, but I know there's lots of things. But there's to be able to see it, yes, so that would be good. So I think that, well, I think you should send it to the different vice deans, definitely of graduate studies, that it should have been, or even, you know, to the dean of graduate studies. As in he should share it with other people.
But I just want to add for this vice deans, if they do watch this, I just want to add one thing. Not to blame anyone.
Okay, we need to finish.
Not
I
the
think we may
administrators,
have.
but just really look at the discourses that shape what we do, you know, so it's important.
Wait.
Yeah, I think there's somebody else waiting to get into the room.
Jeremy?
So thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciated your comments and coming on a Friday afternoon. So yeah. Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. I really didn't. I hope so too. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be lovely to look at this in a bilingual setting. You know, that's the skill that I didn't have. You know, because I don't have the French. You know.
Second language or the international students, it's automatically like if they only were native speakers, then they'd be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is really, you know, I mean, I felt kind of bad, you know, I couldn't really work with the French universities. I really